Hello again. In this video, we're going to be looking at principles of composition. How do we make the marks and the images in a drawing or a design come together to make a cohesive, unified whole? This feeling of unity is really what makes our work expressive, what makes it feel to the viewer as if there is a human soul behind it, right? This is Andy Goldsworthy is a great example of this, I think. If you can imagine seeing these 6 rocks scattered on a forest path, you would walk by them and never give them a thought. But if you saw them lying there, each one carefully cracked in two, each one carefully scratched to whiten up the edges of that crack, each one carefully lined up to make the crack seem to have its own unity and its own life, I think you'd find this very arresting if you came upon it on a pathway. Andy Goldsworthy makes his work by manipulating things that he finds in nature and photographing them. This, to me, is a nice metaphor for the unity that we're trying to create in our compositions. One thing that I'd like you to think about is the edges of your format. So this is really the problem when we're thinking about composition. We are thinking out beyond just the item that we happen to be depicting in a drawing. We're taking responsibility for the whole format that we're working on, edge to edge. Today it's a rectangle. Tomorrow you may be working on a completely different format. But typically the rectangle is a very standard format for people who are drawing and painting, and that's really what we're going to be talking about a lot in this little talk and also in our class as well. Franz Klein, I should say, is an abstract expressionist painter, very well-known, worked in the 50s and 60s, and as you can see, really is working off that tension against the edges of his painting. Any change in the relationship to the edges would really be a huge change in this composition. So one thing we're going to really start to think about now is balance, the satisfying arrangement of elements in a design so that you don't get one part overpowering the other parts. There are 3 fairly distinct kinds of balance that are often used. Radial balance, of course, is actually a very specific type of symmetrical balance. In other words, wherever you draw an axis through a radially balanced composition, you're going to get mirror images or something very close to that on the other side of the axis. So this Bridget Riley composition here, although it's obviously not exactly symmetrical, it is basically following that radial balance format. I'd like you to notice here that she creates the illusion that there are all these curves in her painting, although all she has painted are straight lines, right? Very interesting artist from the Op school of the middle 1900s. Symmetrical balance, of course, exists whenever you can draw an axis right down the middle of a work and have the 2 halves feel as if they are more or less identical. Now here they're not completely identical, right? But you still feel that this is almost like a scale, right? With the 2 items on each side weighing the same, and even the canvas here even being shaped the same way on each side. This altarpiece is by Jan van Eyck, and a wonderful painter who, if you take my classes, you'll see quite a few of his paintings used as examples. Symmetrical balance, I think, is the most common type of balance that I see in the work of student artists, because it seems like an obvious way to balance things. I think it feels safe to people. And in the hands of a master like Van Eyck, it obviously can be, the basis for a really riveting and compelling composition. But I do also think that in the hands of beginners, it is overused and it can be a little bit of a bore. So I'd like you to really consider asymmetrical balance as well. There are many, many ways, for example, that the human body can be balanced. We don't have to stand on our 2 feet facing each other absolutely symmetrically. We can put our weight more on one hip, right? We can stand on our hands on a balance beam, at least some of us can. And this kind of balance, of course, is obviously riskier, but it's more interesting, right? It's a lot more interesting because of the risk and the tension that's involved. And I think we can apply that metaphor to our own design and composition. So if you're going to balance something asymmetrically, you have to think about how you're going to give a feeling of weight, visual weight, to objects that really don't have a literal weight, right? So look at this Robert Motherwell print with me for a moment. I think it's perfectly abstract. You may see images in it. Most people can see images in almost any abstract work. But I tried to find something that was quite abstract. When I ask my students if they feel a satisfying sense of balance from this, I get very mixed answers. Many people feel that that large, dark shape, black or maybe very dark blue, is making the piece feel a little bottom heavy to them. Or people might feel that it's heavy on the left because they think that large, dark shape is kind of weighing down the left side. Not everyone agrees with that, though. Some people feel that the little hand-painted circle and triangle that are sort of attached to the side of that roughly painted rectangle, that they, because they're a little bit more lively, because they're pointy or they look like they were hand-drawn, they may pull our interest over there. Some people feel that that orange background, which has a little bit of texture to it or feeling of being hand-painted perhaps, that has a lot of weight on its own, right? In other words, this isn't a straightforward process, the feeling of balance, right? And yet I think many of us will often agree when we look at a painting, this feels top heavy, this feels left heavy, this feels bottom heavy, or this feels like it's not relating to the edges of the format at all, and therefore is not an integrated composition. It's just maybe a study of a figure, and it doesn't matter how big the page is that it's on, right? A figure or a light bulb or a cheese sandwich or whatever it is you're drawing. So we want to start thinking about composition, to move from the stance that we're just creating a study of an object and to move in the direction of creating a composition on the whole rectangle. So to do that, we need to see what impacts balance, and size and proportion, of course, impact balance very much. You heard me talking about the sizes of those shapes in the Motherwell print. It's clear, I think, that for most people, a big shape outbalances a small shape. A big shape tends to be heavier. Now, it might vary with color, with texture. You know, a lot of things can change that equation, but large objects typically will be visually heavier. 2 or more small objects might balance one large object. Where an object is in your composition, how high or how low it is in the composition, has a huge effect, I think, on the feeling of gravity or its visual weight, right? So if you can imagine this rock, this is another Magritte painting, so from the Surrealist period again. If you can imagine this rock lowered down into the waves, so it's sitting on the sand and jutting out of the water, only occupying maybe about the bottom half of the painting, that's a thought experiment. I can't show you that, obviously, but if you can imagine it, to me, that composition would feel bottom heavy. The thing that makes this composition interesting is the tension of that heavy-looking rock, that it is floating in the air. It seems to be inflated, or maybe it's made of styrofoam or something. So that gives this painting its interest. I think it's much easier to make a painting look bottom heavy, or a drawing, a composition, to make it look bottom heavy than top heavy. The rule of thirds is not a rule at all which you have to follow. It's a sort of a rule of thumb, I would say. But if you're having trouble getting away from symmetry, the rule of thirds is a really good thing to try. And as you can see in this little GIF here, what's going on is that the photograph is basically divided into thirds in both directions, and the interesting things are happening along one of those lines or at the intersections of the lines. Something to try. Another thing that you might try if you're interested in pushing yourself away from symmetry is the golden ratio, or some people call it the golden mean or the golden section. It's a guideline that comes from nature, and it's been used for thousands of years. It does not guarantee you a great composition, but it is a really fun place to start. The golden ratio is derived from the Fibonacci sequence, and I'll show you that here. The Fibonacci sequence is simply a set of numbers starting with 1 and adding another 1, and then after that you simply add the previous two numbers together. And as you add them together and put these grids next to each other, you will find that they begin to spiral out very beautifully. You'll see these forms in shells in nature. The Fibonacci sequence apparently governs how the branches and leaves of some plants are arranged to catch the sun around their stem. You'll find it in the way sunflower seeds are arranged in the head of a sunflower. So it is, for some reason, found in nature and in many seemingly unrelated places, and probably for that reason it has assumed a sort of a mystical status for many designers. You can find lots and lots of things about the Fibonacci sequence and the golden section if you look them up. There are books and books written about them. Anyway, a fun thing to try. One thing you might do if you want to try this on your rough drafts is simply lay out a grid like this, lay it out in pencil, and then go over those heavy lines in charcoal. And then you can invert it onto your paper and print the charcoal lines lightly onto your paper and see if it helps you to create a feeling of asymmetrical balance. So these are all rules of thumb. They are rules that are often broken, and yet I do think they will give you good guidance as you think about balancing your composition. A large object is visually heavier than a small object. Numerous objects can balance one. Dark objects tend to be heavier than light ones. Textured objects, or any objects that are highly detailed or that seem to have been given a lot of TLC by the artist, a lot of tender loving care. An object that's placed close to the central axis may seem visually heavier because of its importance being close to the center. Objects, I think, that are higher in the composition can get away with being a little bit larger or visually heavier, whereas objects that are in the bottom of a composition may easily make it feel bottom heavy if you're not careful. And don't forget that you can try the rule of thirds in the golden section if you're trying to figure out a way to just get out of symmetry, which is can be a bit of an overdone thing for some beginners. So I hope that this will help as you work to create interesting compositions.